Well, welcome along to this video where I am immediately going to issue a rant alert. I'm very pleased to be joined by Elite Investor Club Chairman Graham Rowan, and Graham's going to be joining me to discuss a very trending topic at Property Tribes, and that is, who do we vote for? Landlords have had an absolute hammering from the Conservative government. I think, we're all very disillusioned that the Conservatives seem to have, really changed their stance about supporting business people and encouraging entrepreneurialism. But Graham, who do we vote for? There's not any choice.
It's pretty scary, I have to say. There's an interesting statistic I read recently that in the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, 7,000 millionaires have left the UK. Most of them are entrepreneurs, they're self-made business owners. And the reason, yes, they're upset about taxes, yes, they're upset about some of the specifics we can talk about, but their biggest reason is that they are so despairing of our political system across all parties. It is just total chaos. It's an embarrassment. I don't know what the rest of the world thinks when they're looking in at what's been going on here, but they cannot get their act together. So much so that some of our most successful people, and these are not people who've inherited billions, these are ground up from scratch millionaires, self-made, have walked away from this country because they're so upset at the state it's in. So it doesn't surprise me that we're struggling to decide who to vote for.
Indeed. Well, let's talk about the Conservatives. In the property context, we've had so many housing ministers over the last few years. There's been no coherent policy. As we said, in fact, on your recent radio broadcast, you said that you almost feel like the Conservatives have a vendetta against landlords. What makes you really feel so strongly?
Well, I'm trying to square this circle, because on the one hand, we've had 8 housing ministers in 9 years, so you think, well, there can't be any kind of coherent policy. On the other hand, there have been something like 23 anti-landlord pieces of legislation in 5 years. So you think, well, there's a bit of a theme here, a bit of a trend emerging, So I don't know whether, George Osborne had some terrible experience with his landlord at university or something and vowed that one day he was going to get them
revenge.
Back. Exactly. There must be something like that, because it's just been non-stop. I mean, Section 24 is probably the most obvious one. That's transformed a lot of property investments from positive to negative cash flow. I think a lot of people are very slow to see the full impacts of that, and I think it'll be 2021 before what I call the dumb money wakes up to that. The smart money is already getting out. But no, there's been so many measures, and they're all, these things have unintended consequences, So part of that radio interview is a guy who heads up an organisation for people who do inventories, and they're being decimated by these new rules on fees that can't be charged to tenants and so on, So there's all these things happening. So the Tories have definitely had it in for landlords. They've not really done business owners any favour. They've had no coherent business policy. They've increased taxes on dividends massively, which also affects savers and people who are living off their investments. So they've attacked, for me, some of the people you'd think were their core constituents. Yes. Landlords, business owners, the retired, people who've been savers and investors all their lives. So I start wondering, what is it they actually want? Do they actually want people to be dependent on the state so that they will vote for the people that will bribe them with whatever the goodies on offer are, versus, you and I want to be financially independent so that we don't care who's in Downing Street or who's in the White House. But I kind of think even Conservative politicians now are so kind of self-interested that they think if we can make these people so hard up, so just about managing, as Theresa May likes to talk about it, maybe they'll vote for us if we bribe them enough. So that's the only logic I can see. But for me, certainly the Tories are no longer the party for successful people, for business owners, for investors, for property folks. They are no friends of ours.
No, I don't think they are. And, as you rightly said, they have previously encouraged people to kind of take responsibility for their financial future. As you say, they're almost, deterring people from doing that now. And these people that perhaps once would have built their own wealth will ultimately end up being reliant on the state in their old age. And there's knock-on effects for that. And as you say, there's just no coherent direction to what they're doing. It's almost just like they're scattergunning about, pulling levers here and there, and they don't understand the collateral damage from that.
Well, actually, sometimes I think it's worse than that. Sometimes I think it's just plain cynical. So if you look at George Osborne's pension freedoms of 2015, at the time, he said those measures would only affect about 180,000 people. The reality is they're affecting about 2 million people. We're now getting doctors who are retiring early because they don't want to pay 55% tax if they go over the pension lifetime limit. That's, again, an unintended consequence. So sometimes it's just really a subtle or hidden way of raising taxes, so they put something in place, especially something really complicated that people don't understand. They then make mistakes and suddenly wallop, they're paying taxes on it. So I'm seeing people now taking money out of their pensions, putting in the high street banks, earning 0.1% a year and thinking they're doing the smart thing. There's no financial education attached to these measures anyway. So we've had a succession of things from the Conservative government that have impacted the kind of people you'd imagine they would have supported. So, other than saying they're the least worst option compared to the alternatives, I can find nothing good to say about them.
No, and let's just touch on Mr. George Osborne for a minute, because he has a lot to answer for. He was the instigator of Section 24 and, stamp duty 3% surcharge, and now he's disappeared from sight, and he's just left this horrendous, chaos behind him, where small landlords who are so important providing housing and indeed housing choice within the private rented sector, they're just being pushed away. Could be he wanted to create room for his institutional investor buddies to move in, and indeed they've had their biggest investment quarter in the first 3 months of 2019. But he's long gone, and we're left to pick up the pieces.
Yeah, I think he's got about 7 jobs now, and I think he's making £1 million a year. So he's not doing too badly, is he? But apart from sniping at Theresa May, obviously, who sacked him through his evening newspaper. No, I used to think Gordon Brown was the worst chancellor this country had ever had, but I think now I'd probably put George Osborne ahead of him. I think when his Section 24 tax came out, the Daily Telegraph described it as an Alice in Wonderland tax. Every other business in the world, you have revenue minus costs equals taxable profit, except being a landlord in the UK. So nice one, George. I don't know what you were smoking when you dreamed up with that one.
Now let's move on to the Labour Party. Obviously, Jeremy Corbyn, we've had the likes of Alan Sugar saying that if Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, he will leave the UK. Corbyn, not a friend of landlords, already hinting at rent controls and other measures to suppress private enterprise. What's your view on him?
Probably unbroadcastable, I would think, to be fair, but let me try and tone it down a bit. I think it's quite incredible and a massive indictment of the Conservative government that somebody who 2 years ago was a complete joke and who has been kicking at an open goal in opposition for 2 years without scoring, suddenly is now a serious potential candidate to become Prime Minister of this country. It's a massive indictment of the Tories, frankly. He, to be fair, has been fairly transparent about the fact he's a Marxist who wants to take us back to the 1970s. I think he's probably a lot more transparent about his policies than any of the potential candidates to take over the Tory party, for example, although Boris Johnson made it very clear what he thinks of business owners with a 4-letter tirade a little while ago. So, yeah, I think Corbyn, you get what's on the tin. He's going to do things like, yes, obviously he's going to come after landlords even more with rent controls, with unlimited fines and all sorts of things. But let's not forget, he's also going to confiscate 10% of your company to give to the employees. He's going to introduce capital controls. So once the pound has crashed under his leadership, he'll actually ban you from taking money out the country. So you'll be totally trapped. And I think he'll introduce much higher taxes just as a political lever sometimes. I think his sidekick, John McDonnell, is actually on a charm offensive in the city at the moment, going around for tea with the city institutions, and they are actually warming to him, would you believe? And he's saying, yeah, we are going to put up corporation tax by about 30%, and yeah, we're going to have a financial transaction tax, and all sorts of other things. But I think basically, again, quite an indictment of the Tories. He is at least engaging with business and engaging with the city and building some relationships, which is far more than spreadsheet Phil is doing. So, who happens also to be my MP, unfortunately. But yeah, so I think, it's clear what we're going to get. I tell you, one of the things that frightens me the most is Corbyn's popularity with young people. Because to me, they are now wanting the state to do more for them rather than having to do things for themselves. And I think that's a really scary prospect for the future of this country because, my generation is part of that sort of post-war baby boom that really kind of worked hard and achieved quite significant social mobility in terms of, wealth and everything else. This generation somehow seems to have given up on all that and they want the state to sort them out with jobs and houses and everything else. And that's a worry to me that kind of mindset in the millennial generation is not going to really do much for the economy of this country going forward.
No, I totally agree. And, well, outside of the Conservatives and the Labour Party, what other choice is there?
Well, I mean, inevitably, the Lib Dems have bounced back in the local council elections because everyone's so hacked off with the two main parties, mainly, I suppose, for not delivering Brexit. We've now got Nigel Farage jumping in with his Brexit Party for the European elections, and I suspect he'll do very well there because he's, a strong personality and there's a lot of people upset that Brexit hasn't happened. The Lib Dems, I think they were quite damaged by their time in the coalition. I think they lost their own identity there. So I would imagine what could easily happen is we end up with a sort of a balanced vote between Labour and Tories and maybe a balance of power with the Lib Dems in the middle. So suddenly they could actually become quite significant again, although it's possible equally that the Tories could get such a pasting that Corbyn gets a majority. So to try and answer your question as to who to vote for, I'd reluctantly, with holding my nose at the prospect, probably have to say the Tories were somewhat the least of the worst options. But, none of them filled me with confidence, and none of the candidates for taking over the Tory party filled me with confidence. We just have a total political leadership vacuum in the UK at the moment.
And what a sad state of affairs that we're saying that. I just want to touch on Nigel Farage because I did interview him about 5 years ago. And I have to say, whatever you think of his politics, he actually was very knowledgeable about the housing situation in the UK. He very much valued private landlords. And one thing he said was that landlords should have direct payment from housing benefit and not to go, and he wasn't a fan of universal credit. And of course, we've got the Tories to thank for universal credit as well, creating massive problems for people, massive rent arrears, really impacting on small landlords. That's something else that they've brought in that has really had a huge negative impact on both tenants and landlords. And ultimately, Graham, what we have to point out to the mainstream media who do all this landlord bashing is that anything that impacts landlords ultimately will impact tenants as well, and probably not in a positive manner.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly, Nigel comes from a city and financial background. I think he is much more clued up than many of them, and I think it's probably one of those sad sort of acts of fate that if he had somehow ended up in the Tory party, I think he'd have been a very strong cabinet minister, maybe even prime minister. He's a very strong personality and very knowledgeable. And I think that's why his political parties have achieved what they have achieved from such a small base. But yeah, the Tories have an awful lot to answer for. In some ways, I think you could almost say it's hard to imagine how it could get any worse under Labour, which is not something I'd ever said 3 or 4 years ago. I think it probably would get worse, actually. But I think it's really hard to know who to vote for. And what I say to my own members is that, you've got to arrange your affairs in such a way that ultimately you're not dependent on who's in Downing Street. And that's why I've got, property and assets overseas. I've got other options that, I've got as a sort of plan B. And I would say to anyone that's got at least, let's say, a 7-figure net worth, you should have a plan B. If you look at the family offices of the super rich, they have what they call a last plane out strategy, which is to say, if there's rioting in the streets, if there's 95% tax, if, what would we do? Where would we go? And so they have a plan. And they're global citizens. They've got another place to go. That's obviously, Alan Sugar would be in a similar position as you mention him. So anyone at that end of the spectrum already has those plans. My argument would be to more what you might call the mass affluent people. What's your thoughts on this? Because, it'll get to the point where you and perhaps your children could be massively impacted by some of these political strategies. Are you just going to lie there and take it? Or are you going to get some kind of plan in place to overcome this? So my bottom line answer is I haven't a clue who I'm going to vote for. All I know is that if the worst happens, I've got somewhere else to go.
Well, I think that's very, very sound advice. And I think just as we finish here, Graham, one thing that certainly landlords don't like is uncertainty. And we have massive uncertainty. We don't know who's going to be next calling the shots in the housing office, whether they have an understanding of our sector. And obviously, as we've been talking about the bigger picture, because landlords are ultimately business people, they're entrepreneurs, and they're part of the group of people affected by these random policies that have been brought in with actually very little thought, often very little consultation with the sector. It's very difficult times ahead for landlords as all this plays out.
Well, it is, yes. And I think with any investment, you always have to ask yourself, would I put new money into this today, knowing everything I now know? And for many years, buy-to-let's been a fantastic investment, and people have put a lot of money into it, and people have made a lot of money from it. There are still niches where you can do that, I think. But I think overall, you have to say, given all the political uncertainty and given the measures that we know have already been taken and some of the things that are being threatened, is this an area you want to put new money into is the first question, and what do you want to do with your existing portfolio is the second question. I know a lot of landlords who are selling up, certainly a lot more who are not putting new money in, and some are, if they've got a big enough portfolio, they're incorporating and taking a slightly different tack to the new measures. But yeah, it's a bizarre set of circumstances we find ourselves in. No one could have predicted this. No. I'm not even sure it was in anyone's manifesto to have such a vendetta against landlords, but we are where we are. I guess probably the only logical answer I can suggest is if you've got assets, you are painting a big target on your chest saying, come and get me. So they go for the low-hanging fruit. And no one's going to riot in the streets in support of landlords. We're on our own with this, so we need to stick together.
Okay, well, on that somber note, I've got to say thank you very much to Graham for sharing his thoughts. And this is actually, we're going to actually produce a sister video to this one, which is going to be called Landlord Death by 26 Cuts. And we're going to be looking at all the anti-landlord policies that have come in to the sector in the last 5 years. So do join us for that. But for now, if you're watching on YouTube, I invite you to click across to propertytribes.com if you want to join our discussions there, or if you prefer to watch on YouTube, please click the subscribe button and notifications so you can be updated of our latest content. So Graham, actually we could talk a lot more, couldn't we? But I think we need to reflect on what the opportunities are here, and the main thing is I think that people should still use their vote.
Oh, absolutely. It's our most fundamental democratic right, and it pains me whenever I see these terribly low turnouts at elections. It's the most important thing we have in a democracy. So I'm not saying don't vote. I'm just saying you're probably as confused as I am about who to vote for.
Indeed. Well, there's more to come on this, and as obviously if we go into a general election, all the different parties will be putting out their manifestos. It may bring some clarity. We know housing is such a hot topic, very high on the political agenda. So I think it's interesting times ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd like to see somebody with some sort of seniority and capability put into the role of housing minister, and maybe even to be there for more than a few months. Then, who knows what might happen? We might have a coherent strategy.
Well, we can live in hope. But thank you so much for sharing these insights, and do stay tuned to propertytribes.com. We'll be seeing more of Graham in the future. Thanks for watching.